Hello, fellow creators. In this video, we learn about hybrid rendering, one of the new features that got introduced with Astro 2.0, and we'll see how you can mix your static content with dynamic content and serve sites that has the power and simplicity and performance of a static, plus all of the capabilities and potential that dynamic brings with it. Right? We'll start with a site Astro Inc., which is currently a statically generated site fully, which has static pages all across, right? And we'll convert some of its pages to actually render on the server side. So let's dive in.
Whenever Astro build is run, it actually generates the pages, right? So for a structure like this, where we have a blog section under pages, we have a tag section. When we actually run the build, Astro actually generates the HTML pages when we run the build command, right? Let's just see the outcome over here. So every page had a directly one-to-one mapping with one of the index.html file, which is grouped by the kind of the structure that we maintain around it, right? So something like about MDX led to about index.html, media Astro led to the index.html inside the media folder. Similarly, for 5 different markdown file, we got 5 different HTML pages, right? This leads to a lot of performance improvement when users are visiting the site because there's no processing involved at the runtime and users directly get the result out of the static file server, right? Which your server is kind of maintaining. If you have something like a TS file or a JS file within the pages folder, you even get not just HTML pages, but static files like a JSON file, right? Something like views.json.ts will lead to something like this particular structure, right? Now, static is all good. Static is all good as long as you have the need to, just serve static content, which means if you have a site like a portfolio site or a marketing site where the change or the frequency of updates is not that often, right? It's good and it's in the interest of the site and different resources involved that, you eventually ship a statically generated site, which means that all of the pages that your site serves are built at the compile time, right? But what if you have, a bit of requirement for some bit of dynamism, right? What if a little bit of interactivity won't do, right? What if you have, say, a product page in an e-commerce site, right, where you have a frequently updating content like prices being updated in the real time, or probably the variant running out of the stock, right? Or something like a blog page itself where you have a views counter, right, which can show the real-time stats of how many time a blog got read. The site generation is good for performance. It's good for serving lightweight sites, but it's not good for the freshness of the data that you serve through the site, right? If you have the need to serve the latest data, if you have the need to always serve the data that's to the moment updated when a user receives it, static isn't the right tool for it, right? It's a good tool when the information that you are publishing has a bit of more shelf life, has a bit of kind of attributes associated that don't make your information or content expire, say, over a day, a month, or a week, or something like that, right? But if you have content or data that's updated too often, then you cannot just take chances with serving data that got compiled probably 10 minutes back or 1 hour back or probably a 1 day back. Who knows? Who knows when did the build last run, right? And to solve exactly for that sort of a problem, Astro did introduce something called a server mode, right? A server mode is a mode where when a user actually requests the site or a page, then only the pages get rendered on the server in sort of a real time. A server basically receives the user request, passes the request, processes the request, and eventually serves the HTML, right? So it's not like all the HTML are already available in some directory to serve. It's not something like this, right? So let's just change back to the server mode and see how this entire thing works. At this point, right, we have Astro 2.0 already available, right? We'll just change the mode for this particular configuration, right? So we'll change this to a server, okay? As soon as we have changed this to server, let's just see the outcome. So far inside the disk folder, you have a about page, you have a API which generates a static file out of our TS file, and then we have a blog directory with all of the individual blogs, right? Similarly, we have a tags directory. So there is a dedicated directory to all sort of content that we maintain in our site, right? So let's just run the build now and see what changes. The very first problem we see as soon as we set the output as server is it says cannot use output server without an adapter. Please install and configure the appropriate server adapter for your final deployment, right? What does this means, right? Let's just investigate what does adding an adapter means for us, right? So adapters are something that take your data and they compile the data in a certain format that could be hosted uh, in a cloud-based service, right? Adapters basically adapt your output to a particular format, right? Today, as soon as you'll enable this, you'll have to add an adapter, and officially Astro supports Cloudflare, Deno, Netlify, Node.js, and Vercel. We have support for full-blown Node.js runtime. You have support for Netlify and Vercel-based serverless functions. You have support for even edge functions through Deno and Cloudflare, right? So what will happen is eventually you won't get pages. You'll get JavaScript files which are runnable on a server platform or a serverless platform, right? And for that, since the output or the expectation for all of these adapters can vary, we have a specific adapter catering to specific services or specific, service providers, right? So let's just add an adapter over here. Let's just do yarn astro add Vercel. Let's go ahead with a yes. Let's go ahead with a change. Now the Vercel adapter is added in our Astro config file. It imported the serverless adapter from Vercel and then eventually added this to adapter config for our Astro config file, right? Now let's just go ahead and run the build again. The static builds you get auto-generated sitemap, which isn't the case with the dynamic mode or the server mode. So we get necessary or essential and useful notice from the CLI that we need to configure it differently. But let's just keep ourselves focused to the output of this particular exercise, right? So now the dist file folder is gone, right? We don't see a dist folder anymore. What we see now is a Vercel directory which has two folders, one for static and the another one for functions, right? If you look into static, you have all the static assets available over here, right? All the images that you refer to, right? All the HTML files and all, right? And functions now has all your pages, right? Now, if we see here, how many pages are we having here? Probably just one entry file and chunks for all of our markdown files, right? So we had 5 markdown files. We received kind of 5 JavaScript functions that are kind of invocable as serverless functions. Now let's just see this live. How does it changes our development experience? Site is running all fine. Let's just go back and look at this one, if it's working fine or not. This is working perfectly fine. Blog page, it errored for us. Tags, it's working fine. Media, about. So all of these pages, the index pages, if you see, are majorly working fine, right? But the way it's working behind the scene is different, right? With the static build mode, you received HTML pages, fully compiled HTML pages, and you got very performant, and very speedy responses. With the server mode, it's not just that you compromise on the speed. The speed is still matchable to an extent, but the change is in the technique, the mechanism that's followed behind it. So the data or the response is actually served when it's requested, right? And that's why you don't see a dedicated file for a home page or a tags page or a media page, because this page is generated when you actually are requesting it, right? Now let's just open one of these internal pages. It errored for us, just like the way it errored for us on the blog page. So let's see what's the reason there, right? Let's just go inside it. So about MDX is working for us, and the reason is it's purely a static page. There's not much logic involved here, right? Some front matter and then just basic MDX file, right? Again, for something like a blog page, the index page wasn't having much of a logic for the index itself, but we did have something like get static paths over here, right? And that's the case, if you see, is with the tags page also. In the tags page also, we have something like a get static props. Now the tag page is working just fine for us, right? It's working just fine for us for the index, right? And the reason is the index page again is a very basic index page. You have some component imported, few values defined, and get collection being called, and then so the instruction currently are in a form that Astro can understand, that Astro can interpret even at the runtime. So the current code in the tags index file, which is making it work or making it click for Astro, is in a format that Astro understands, right? Similarly for the home page, it's working just fine. The tags page, it's working just fine. Media working just fine, and about is also working perfectly fine. And the reason is the syntax or the command or the instructions you have, if you see, that's placed in these files are all basic commands and instructions, right? There's not much dynamism here. It's all Astro can understand and interpret and parse while we are actually requesting the page, right? But the blog page is failing for us, and the tags page is failing for us, right? And the reason is because we have something called get static paths over here, right? Now, get static paths has its significance only for the static build, which means that this function has now kind of lost its charm, right? It's useful and it's the most powerful method as long as you're compiling your site all at the build time. But as soon as you enable the server mode, your files stop acting as a way to tell Astro that you have got to generate files at compile time. They change their request. What they tell to Astro now that hey, there's no more compilation step involved, right? You've got to process this request. You have got to render this page when you actually receive the request from the user. If you see the warning here, it says get static path is ignored when output server is set, which means we cannot do this anymore, right? So how will we let some pages be generated statically while we are in a server mode? Because we don't want to go all server mode, right? We don't want to go all dynamically. So what we can do here now is we can enable something called export const pre-render Once we have this enabled, we'll have to enable this for all of the pages where you want to leverage the get static path still, right? Even if in the server mode, if you want to leverage the get static paths, or if you want to generate pages statically and not use the dynamism, then you'll have to place this pre-rendered true to all of the files. Mark that this file is not having any dynamic content. What we should do is we should enable pre-render for the tags page. We should enable pre-render for the abouts page. This is the wrong place for it. Since it's a markdown file, we cannot do it over here. It will get compiled to static anyways. In the Astro file, for the blog, we'll have to again say that this page needs to be pre-rendered. Similarly, this page needs to be pre-rendered, right? Tags page needs to be pre-rendered. And here index page needs to be pre-rendered. This worked, right? And this page needs to be pre-rendered. So pre-render or marking the different dynamic files even as pre-render is an opt-in exercise. So Astro is static by default, but as soon as you enable the server mode, you become server by default or dynamic by default. And that's why every page or every dynamically generated page that needs to be still generated at the compile time or the build time needs to have this particular flag or indicator available for Astro to understand that this particular file needs to be generated at the build time, right? Once we have this all available inside all of the file we maintained in the site at this point, we can just go ahead and see the outcome, right? So this is all changed now. Blog is having the pre-render property, page is having the pre-render property. So I think we are pretty much all done, right? Let's just see the outcome now. Home is working just fine. Tags is working just fine. Blog is working just fine. Media, about, everything is working just fine, right? So we have kind of restored the previous behavior even in the server-side mode by enabling or adding the condition called pre-render equal to true, which indicates to Astro that this page or the certain group of pages are still supposed to be treated as compile time pages even when the server-side mode is enabled, right? So this mode of mixing static with server mode, where you have the ability to serve the request on the fly and you are still compiling certain pages statically at the build time based on your site's or application's use case, is called the hybrid mode. Rendered. Now let's just see what will be the steps needed to convert one of the, say, static pages to the dynamic one. So we have the blog pages which are all generated statically, right? Blog, this is all static generation, right? What if you want to make this dynamic? So the very first step to make this dynamic is to remove or not have the pre-rendered true at all, right? As soon as you do this, it will error for you, right? Because what's happening now is when you're requesting this particular page, it's trying to retrieve the result. And as soon as it's trying to retrieve the result or process the result and serve it to you, it's encountering something like get static paths, right? Which isn't a valid construct for the server-side mode. So we'll have to get rid of this particular function, right? Now we'll have to revert to a mode which is more conscious of the server-side build, right? So props is not something which will be available for us now because props was available to us through this get static path, which generated all of the slugs dynamically and the entry dynamically at the compile time and then served it to us through props. Now we'll have to rely on the params method to understand about first the slug, to identify the content that needs to be served for a certain slug, and then to actually generate the content based on that slug, right? So what we can do now is we can do something like use the params, take the slug, convert this to entry entirely, right? And use something called get entry by slug. It's a method available out of the content collection API only, which lets us retrieve a single piece of content out of a collection, right? So now we can await the response, and then we can tell about the slug, right? Let's just consider that this is available all the time, right? So what we did here, right? We removed the get static paths. It's not needed anymore for us. Let's just remove get collection. It's not needed for us. Fetch a content by its slug. Use the entry. The entry structure doesn't changes yet, right? So you have the entry available to you. And then what we are doing here is we are still using the same content collection method render to get the content that could be rendered on the page, right? So let's just save this and see the outcome. This page worked for us, right? You'll only have to change from props to params, because now what's happening is when we are actually requesting this particular page, this particular value is going as a slug to our server, and then we're receiving that slug on the fly at runtime, and then we're using that slug to actually get a content by its slug, and then again using the methods available out of the content collection API to render the content, right? That's all that's needed, right? Now our page is fully dynamic. Now the content that's served is guaranteed to not be stale or something that was last updated when your build was last compiled. Fresh. It's as fresh as it gets, right? It's generated right at the moment your server receives the request. Since we are processing this request at runtime, while our user is actually making a request, we are processing the entire data that needs to be served to the user. We can do many things here, right? We can probably get the views count for a certain post, like to the minute update, or get something like the likes count, right? Besides the primary use case, right? So this data that we are retrieving here can be totally pulled out of a database, right? It doesn't just needs to rely on the content that's being generated out of the markdown files that you are maintaining with your application, right? You can entirely pull this piece out of a database by establishing a real connection with a PostgreSQL database or like a Redis database, right?
Hope you liked the video. Hope you understood how hybrid rendering works. In my next video, we'll take this static plus dynamic or hybrid render site and we'll bring in a Redis cache to store the views counter on these individual blocks. See you in my next video. Bye bye.